Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Vindya Bhupitia, and on behalf of the Photo Demos Collective, it's my great pleasure to welcome our speakers and participants who seem to have joined us from all around the world today, which is pretty excellent, for the second day of our virtual program for Citizens of Photography. The first session today will be centered on the theme of images, politics, and audiences. I'm honored to introduce our stellar panel today, who will be speaking on photography spanning Portugal, Nicaragua, and Georgia. Our first speaker, Susan Meiselas, is an internationally renowned documentary photographer, notable for her documentation of human rights issues in Latin America. She's the author of a number of celebrated photography books, including Carnival Strippers, Nicaragua, Kurdistan in the Shadow of History, and Tar Beach. Susan has been the president of the Magnum Foundation since 2007, which supports and trains the next generation of documentary photographers. I believe that Taslima Akhtar, who will be speaking in our second session today, was a Magnum Fellow mentored by Susan. Susan's acclaimed survey exhibition, Mediations, will be on view at the Kunsthaus Wien in Vienna starting today, and will be on until the 13th of February 2022. Christopher Pinney and Ileana Selejan will speak more on Susan's extraordinary career and practice at the end of this session, when she will be awarded the 2021 Royal Anthropological Institute Photographic Studies Award. Secondly, we have Nestan Nizaraje, who co-founded the Tbilisi Photography House in 2007 and currently serves as its director. Nestan is also the co-founder and co-artistic director of the Tbilisi Photo Festival, an annual international photography festival in which the Photo Demos Collective were absolutely privileged and delighted to have participated in 2019. The Tbilisi Photo Festival, now in its 11th year, was conceived of as a central meeting point for photography from different regions, as well as to showcase and promote emerging regional photography. Finally, Photo Demos colleague and friend Ileana Selejan, who researched photography in Nicaragua. She's a research fellow with the Decolonizing Arts Institute and an associate lecturer at the University of Arts in London. Her research focuses on photography and documentary practices in Central America. Ileana was the Linda Wyatt Gruber 66 Curatorial Fellow in Photography at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College. She received her PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University and was granted the 2012-13 Joan and Stanford Alexander Award for the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. So to start off with, we will have Susan presenting, followed by Ileana and then Nestan. So over to you, Susan.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Chris, for this invitation. As some of you might imagine, it's a little intimidating to speak as a practitioner to those of you who have such wise words. So I'm going to, this is really going to be a talk that's more like drawn from the raw field notes. I've chosen to share a project which is still being processed, truly. But just a kind of context that my practice is often a combination of images or frames, I like to say, that I make and the frameworks of inclusion that I create as a dialogical approach. I think of my body, strangely, as carrying forward its history as its own archive. So when I think about the photograph as an object, it's also a relationship, and often focusing on the power dynamic around who makes the photograph and who it's for. So my recent project in Porto is drawing from work that I had done about a decade ago in a place called Cova da Moura on the outskirts of Lisbon, which is considered an illegal settlement of Cape Verdeans, along with others from Portugal's former colonies. And my visit was shaped by two invitations. First, an open commission to do a project anywhere in Portugal, and the second from a small brochure I found at the Office of SOS Racism, where I read about a community that was welcoming strangers to tour their neighborhood. Whoops. Bringing back pictures or returning myself has often been part of my process. In Cova da Moura, as I began to meet people, I immediately gave them a signed Polaroid picture, both as an acknowledgement of that moment we shared and as a trace of our crossing, a gesture towards our connection. A few months later, I came back to do a workshop with teenagers of the community, encouraging them to engage and document their own daily lives. And some weeks after that, those teens became the guides for guests visiting from Lisbon, creating a walking tour through the maze of narrow streets to discover their own community through the photographs we had all made. My portraits of them, this may be a little loud, sorry. My portraits of them were hung on laundry lines or mounted, I don't know how to control the sound for them, if you can still hear me, or mounted outside the places where I had made them. But theirs were presented in the central plaza, a representation of the community by and for the community, bringing the distance of visitors closer by crossing the borders that had divided them. Travessia, which means crossing in Portuguese, to traverse across time, space, and technologies, is the work begun in the midst of COVID last fall, following a call from the curator Lydia Matthews to consider imagining a project with the Afro-descendent community in Porto last May for the Biennale. For me, it began with the question, what can I contribute as a documentary photographer when not present or on the ground with a camera? Is it a socially distanced relationship even possible? Is a socially distanced relationship even possible, especially with our COVID isolation and confinement? So our process began through Zoom with an introduction to 3 important potential partners. This would be an experimental collaboration. The sociologist Ligia Ferro from the University of Porto, her master's student Beatriz Lazardo, and former student and Brazilian-born artist Dori Negro. Initially, we began with scholarly research via the internet. We learned from Ligia and others that in Porto, unlike Cova da Moura, the Afro-descendant community was dispersed throughout the city and thus seemingly invisible. The internet could obviously only look in from the outside. So the online research started us wondering what other places were meaningful to the community. Dori suggested we first visit an elder, Doña Claudia, who for decades had been vital to sustaining an association that served the community in multiple ways. Showing Doña Claudia the printed out internet maps, she began to correct them with the knowledge of what was past but no longer present. She started to share stories about lesser known places where there was still an African presence, including where some banana trees had once been planted along the river. Each week became a distinct adventure, coordinated across 3 time zones from Athens, where Lydia was based, to Porto, to New York. We were led from one street to another. Here, Dori takes us on a tour to a few places where he had once joined others in an Afro restaurant, which was forced to close from the pressures of gentrification downtown. Over several months, we followed a series of guides extending our eyes. My frame is constrained and controlled by others. We were evolving a small network over time, learning through others who were leading us through the city's changes they were seeing. This is Ishmael on the right, a friend of Bia's, who brought us to the street known for a number of African barbers. And then we go via Zoom, this time watching his hair being cut, recording with videos as his barber tells us that his clients don't believe he's the real owner. So we are absent but present in this curious way. We both follow, we accompany. As Doña Claudia meets her old friends Emilia and Paola in the public housing project where they've lived for a decade, we listen to conversations, often with no translation, not fully understanding, but hoping again to gather fragments of counter histories from a multi-generational perspective, without the intention of presenting a grand epic narrative. One week leads into the next, a different direction. This time, Emilia, who we had just met, takes us across the railroad tracks to Rio Bom, where she had her garden plot for 13 years before moving. And we see the banana trees we had heard about months before of that forgotten community living at the edge of the River Douro. So the still frames of our Zoom encounters, along with short movie clips, were starting to shape our experience. And yet we were searching for a way to collaborate more directly with the community we were beginning to know at this distance. That led to the idea of giving a workshop for a small group who were welcoming and curious to annotate photographs which would mean writing about some of the very places that they had shown us. So I'm just going to give you a sampling. Within a few weeks, we began collecting and translating a multitude of images, nearly 50 in the end, each with a personal story visualized with reflections for strangers, each with their own aesthetic, presenting whatever they chose to share, sometimes with a fusion of source, sometimes my Zoom pictures or the ones they made or those that they found. Just to give you a quick translation of the one on the left. I was in the elevator waiting to reach my floor destination. Distracted with my phone, I suddenly felt someone pull my hair and say, "It's soft, right?" This kind of situation happens on a recurring basis in Portugal, on the street, in buses, at parties, or even in hospitals. These invasive attitudes really reveal the look of exotification to Black phenotypes. The work, "Don't Touch," makes reference to the warning signs of museums and cultural spaces that refrain from touching works of art. The same applies to the hair and the bodies, in parentheses, of Africans and Afro-descendants, which are in fact real works of art and are not supposed to be touched without the required authorization and consideration. The one on the right, just briefly, my worst night in Porto. I still do not pass by that street until today, and am distressed. I'm distressed whenever I see any PCP car. I still remember the faces and names of the policemen today, and I know they are still on duty downtown. Go back to your land. My home is where my heart is, and my home is where I pay taxes. Porto, carajo, how much I love you. Your waters, your guts, your slender, your granite. And on the right, a conversation between two longtime friends. This word, for example, is a word that hurts. Yes, only last year I realized the origin. Since then, I've been paying more attention to this word. Last year, yes, a Brazilian friend explained that the senzala was the house of the slaves. You didn't know? No, I don't remember speaking about it. But we talked about the term in school. We did? Yes, you probably didn't notice since you're white. So this was an unpredictable journey of a virtual discovery filled with a lot of uncertainty about what could be co-created or what conversations might be provoked. The gallery walls held their images. The space recorded their voices about life in Porto. We envisioned the remapping of Porto, an alternative city map with a set of spatial relations, a landscape filled with memories through images, still and moving, along with contributed objects, each triggering a QR code with a short video story. The expanding community network is as important as the artifacts of this experimental collaborative process of recovery and reflection with what has been passed on and generously offered in exchange. The performance, oops, it's not playing, sorry. That's too bad it's not playing. The performance story presented was his own memory map. It will now have an international platform through our Travessia app, soon to be a website and archive. His video was placed along with our exhibit in the university where Dory studied and where there are still no Black faculty. So the question remains, what will resonate when the walls no longer hold these shared memories, having invited participation in a public provocation? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Susan. So I think we will move now to Ileana, if you're ready.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure, just 1 second to share my screen. Thank you. Can you see my screen all right?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so my presentation today concerns the use of photography in recent protests in Nicaragua. And it's based on fieldwork that I have undertaken as part of the Citizens of Photography project. Just going to switch to my microphone. so that the sound is clear. Okay, so April 19th, 2018, the streets of Managua, Nicaragua erupted in protest. What began the day before as a small gathering to contest a controversial tax increase quickly amplified in response to attacks from government supporters and police and violent police repression. Word of la insurrección, or the insurrection, the uprising, spread within a matter of days. While students occupied universities, citizens took to the streets, reacting against the generalized corruption and abuse of the Ortega Murillo regime. People set up barricades within neighborhoods and tranques, or roadblocks, along the city's main traffic routes. Solidarity marches were held, amassing tens of thousands of protesters from Managua and elsewhere. Civil disobedience actions ranged from the painting of graffiti and pintas, or tags, to the defacement and taking down of propaganda posters and public monuments. A self-denominated movement of autoconvocados, or self-assembled, self-organized, began to take shape. During the first days of unrest, while TV channels were censored, citizens used mobile applications and online platforms such as Facebook and WhatsApp to organize themselves and to share documentation of confrontations with anti-riot police and government supporters. For several weeks, all happenings and events were streamed 24/7 via social media. Photographing served multiple functions: to view and record happenings that were exceptional and perceived as such, to bear testimony and provide evidence in light of the government's denial of all responsibility, manipulation of facts, and continued repression, and to deploy online in order to call the citizenry to action. Perhaps unintendedly, the images, videos, and stories crossing the feed also served to reactivate memory. Scenes from the Sandinista revolution appeared to be replayed on the streets, as identified by numerous observers. Now, the Sandinista front, the FSLN, had originally come to power after a nationwide popular insurrection toppled the regime of Anastasio Somoza in 1979. Daniel Ortega was elected president in 1984 until 1990. And under his leadership, the FSLN returned to power in 2006. Rosario Murillo, his wife, became vice president following the 2016 general elections. During April 2018, one revolution seemed to overlap the memory of the other, as millennial youth sought to reclaim the symbols of dissent that their predecessors had deployed during the late 70s and 1980s. So in what follows, I wish to provide, In what follows, I wish to provide an analysis of the imagery that accompanied the rise of the April protests, reflecting on the use of the camera phone as a tool for demanding justice, as well as for witnessing and documenting live history. The sudden appearance of new images in the public sphere manifested itself as an overflow of content against the backdrop of prolonged silence due to censorship. This effervescence nonetheless spurred iconoclastic acts on a par, and here one is reminded of Bruno Latour's thesis concerning the generative potential of iconoclastic actions, their accelerated movement, jolting perception out of stasis, summoning, calling to action. So the feed became the primary locus where this Latourian cascading of images became manifest. And I would like to share one example that might illustrate the type of galvanizing procedure that was in use between the street and the screen during the weeks of unrest. I am interested in how visual tropes were made and remade, picking up reference points from previous visual political constellations, sampling from along a loosened spatio-temporal timeline of events. So starting on April 21st, increasing numbers of pictures of students in violent warlike scenarios started to be circulated on social media and in the press. Young men and women battling the riot police, streets strewn with rocks and fragments of glass, Molotovs flying one way, tear gas, rubber bullets, and the occasional live round in response. A caricaturist picked up a particularly heroic image, and so did the online community, wherefrom it started moving around the digital realm, reshaped in multiple memes. The speech bubble Libertad invokes Eugène Delacroix's Liberty Guiding the People, from 1830, although the gesture draws further connections. A range of responses appeared online, from historic pictures of the Sandinista revolution and commentary relating the two, to references from outside the local context. Images from the Paris student revolts of '68, Banksy, and here an intervened or quote unquote vandalized Banksy. The image appeals to global imaginaries of resistance, identifying moments of overlap. So, can we speak of a repertoire of unrest, of constellations of images and tropes constituted out of mutually referential and perhaps mutually reinforcing images? Or is there an immediate fall into cliché? In the following weeks and months, the image of a figure throwing a rock, or rather this defiant pose, will be identified repeatedly as a key trope. Finally, so these are just further iterations. And finally, the gesture was turned into a stencil, multiplying onto the city's walls. Here, one encounters an immediate connection to an image that has become almost synonymous with Nicaragua, Susan Meiselas' so-called Molotov Men, taken on the last day of the popular insurrection of 1979. The parallel did not escape protesters and online observers who almost immediately drew this association into memes and through collage. Meiselas' picture held its ground. Even in this new context, it still contained all the reference for the struggle. Behind the figure, the barricade. In his hand, the Molotov cocktail, or in this case, a stone. The boina, worn in solidarity with El Che, replaced by a baseball cap. I interpret such collages as deliberate attempts to reclaim the picture or to re-engage, reactivate it in the present context. Additional pictures by Meiselas and other photographers who documented the 78-79 insurrection crossed the feeds, spliced onto present realities through powerful comparisons, themselves soon discarded. An element most deeply ingrained in the Nicaraguan public imagination, the barricade, became a symbol of resistance during the insurrection of 78-79. As if fulfilling a prophecy or performing an oft-rehearsed, never-forgotten task, people started building them right away in 2018. And similar to its precedent, April brought about a revolt of basic means and in plain clothes. Young people started covering their faces with masks and t-shirts, using a type of folding that resembles armor. There were numerous attempts to reclaim, repossess, re-signify in the visual realm that played out on the streets during those days. And photography was the means through which all of these gestures were engaged. It was performative, made to be revisited, seen again and again as trace. Throughout the 3 months of unrest, protesters, officials, and the public alike minutely recorded events in Managua and around the country, sometimes as a means to understand, perhaps in retrospect, those very actions they were confronted with firsthand. There was a shared awareness that cameras became a continuous presence once the crowds reached critical mass and converged at key sites. Citizen journalism was practiced in the streets and learned by doing, while photojournalists, quote unquote, hunted for iconic or more representative images. The people's pictures were more striking due to their immediacy, trembling, blurred, uploaded raw, straight into the stream from the intimacy of one's phone. And here we might think of Hito Styles' theorizing of the poor image. Much of this content was transferred online, where it lived and continues to linger with a chance of becoming reactivated in perpetuity. No individual image captured in this context works in isolation. Rather, they're all mutually referential and can potentiate, reactivate one another, establishing new relations, revealing photography's capacity to perform iconoclastically, even when latent. The archive is more than fragment and ever short of complete. It is recursive, haunted. It is, in an imaginative, future-oriented sense, inexhaustible, while the repertoire, and I'm thinking here with performance studies scholar Diana Taylor, may be reconstituted in perpetuity. The very movements of the crowd that helped make this monument also made it photographable, people streaming up and down along its sides, while the rest of the protesters passed by viewing it and photographing it. The living monument, stationary if only for a brief moment as individuals stop and pose, is itself a picture. My image is only a trace. It derives its power from its temporariness. And here, the image event, as theorized by Karen Strassler, functions as a participatory structure. An image ecology, an environment, or a visual economy, to use a phrase coined by anthropologist Deborah Poole, emerges at the intersection of all lines of sight and is negotiated in between participant-subject positions. This excess of vision, everyone's phone shoots and records continuously, has provoked a shift in the subject position, and the selfie immerses the subject viewer into the scene. I would go even further and argue that a form of extreme reflexivity is at play where the ultimate exchange of gazes happens in digitally interconnected space. So, turning to Ariel Azule, are we to read these photographic gestures as anticipatory, contributing to the making of a new civil contract? Does the Nicaraguan case constitute a clear example of photography becoming a key means for people to demand rights in advance of actualized representation? Photographs are certainly participating in a process of renegotiating the public sphere that has already begun, yet which has been suspended by state power. It remains to be seen how this surge in image production will impact the public imagination in the long term and generate change. Even if temporarily, photography has enabled the creation of a social space where the field of politics could be reconfigured anew. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ileana. If Nestan is ready, if we can take off.
Yes.
Great. Perfect.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Great. Thanks, Nestan.
Yeah. Close that. Sorry. Thank you again for the invitation, and it's my pleasure to mention a few words about hidden archives and what we already have learned and what we still have to learn from all the politically incorrect imagery of the Soviet period that we are discovering step by step. And it's, of course, just a small part, but I cannot not mention few words just about the period of before and how medium of photography has started in Georgia, because it's also kind of part of the hidden stories. At least story of Georgian photography and the richness of its traditions is not yet well known outside of Georgia and on the international sense. So I profit of this occasion, and I would start with a little bit historical overview to say that when we talk about photography, evolution of photography in Georgia, we talk about three main periods, of course, that are spanning on 3 centuries, 19th, 20th, 21st, and first is, of course, the Golden Age. That starts with the introduction of photography in 1840s in Georgia and lasts till the end of 19th century. And of course, Soviet period when communist regime used art, including photography, as tools of as tool of ideological propaganda. And of course, New Wave, the period of kind of photographic revolution that began in the early 90s in a post-Soviet, very challenging period in all ex-Soviet republics, including Georgia. All the images that you see on the screen are part of the big and very rich collection of 19th century photography conserved in the National Museum of Photography. And this is also the collection, very small, tiny part of the collection that needs to be, of course, being like better represented outside of Georgia, because it testifies of richness and exciting history of medium in Georgia. And of course, it all starts with this very specific geopolitical location of the Georgia on the crossroads of Asia and Europe. And because of that, also all the cultural, European cultural innovations were reaching Georgia very quickly. The first cinema, first cinema projection took place in Tbilisi a year after the Parisian premiere and the first announcement about the use of this new European technique able to produce an image of nature and the man was published by the local newspaper, one of the leading newspapers in Kafkas in 1846, just a few years after official announcement of photography. And since that period, most end of the 19th century, the development of the medium of photography testifies Georgia's openness to European cultural legacy. And that takes like a huge role compared to the start of the Soviet occupation and all the dramas and tragedies and the influences that it had on not only on cultural but political and social development of the country. I put these few images of the collection of the pioneer of photography in Georgia, like scenes of traditional massage, reproduced it in his own studio by Alexander Oinashvili. And of course, things start to change with the Soviet occupation that starts in 1921, and that defines the new vectors of the political life of the young, very young state of Georgia, undergoing its third year of its first short-term independence that lasted only 3 years. And for the following 70 years, the social, cultural development of the country was dramatically influenced by the dogmas of Soviet regime. The images that you see now in row on your screens are part of the official news agency of Soviet period, one of the most powerful ones in Georgia, which was Sokinform, and that was the main producer and also, of course, the main controller of all the imagery produced and ready to go to the publication. And for almost 7 decades, the medium of photography, as well as other arts, has been used as a propaganda, agitational, and educational tool to multiply the canonic and politically correct photographic imagery that was supposed to unveil the most powerful country, USSR, with the most powerful economy, and the Soviet workers, and happiest, let's say, Soviet workers. For that, Soviets and the regime has developed and established kind of new genre of photography, and it was staged photojournalism, totally staged photojournalism, that was the most popular and the most practiced, and so the most developed genre during the Soviet period. The collection of Georgian Soviet photography perfectly reveals this significant paradox, and the paradox was about the staged photojournalist, and because the mise-en-scène became a fundamental component for the Soviet photojournalists, ignoring and neglecting the quintessence of the photojournalism. Thus, that's why the Georgian photographic heritage of Soviet period is mostly rich in propagandistic imagery and not in photography d'auteur. Even more, only 3 important collections, archives, revealed by accident about 15 years ago, can be considered as real bodies of work of propaganda-free photography of this period and rarest examples of Soviet Georgian photography d'auteur. These archives attributed to rather eclectic group of artists, including Gigo Gabashvili, a founder of realism in painting, a shepherd who lived on 2,000 meters above sea level, and a city dandy, Reza Kazeli. 3 of them covered the archives of 3 of these artists covered the period of Soviet occupation till 80s. So here they are, these artists that I will be focusing on now. Gigo Gabashvili, who was a renowned conventional artist, and then in the same time, but discovered like about 10 or 12 years ago that he was also an experimenter in photography with the very courageous attitudes experiments on a naked body. And I should say that this collection is only example of so large amount, or at least known now, maybe there are some more archives hidden, known now, etudes and works on new. Shalval Hanaide, a shepherd, a self-taught photographer from Tusheti, Georgia's remotest high mountain region in the northeast, that borders with Dagestan and Chechnya from Russian Federation, with his collections produced in 50s and 60s in his native region, and Rezo Kazeli, a cameraman, a filmmaker, a kind of Tbilisi John Cassavetes who ignores the visual codes and all the ideological lines dictated by the regime, and unveils in his images produced in 50s, between 50s and 70s, an alternative take on history and reality that is perceived in his archives by the not just a succession of political events, but rather an impression of charmingly chaotic everyday life with its surprising nonchalance, something that of course did not existed in official and controlled photography. So here are just few images, some 3 images by each authors, and all of these 3 artists can be defined as real true free spirits of Soviet Georgian photography, ignoring the strictly shaped aesthetical and contextual visual dogmas of this period. The ensemble of these bodies of work that can be classified as unofficial photography of Soviet period gives totally different vision of the use of the medium of photography in Soviet period, as well as reveals another different reality that is composed of various layers of, I would say, real life, well hidden, not to say unexisting in the imagery of so-called polished reality of Soviet period. These hidden archives unveil the imagery of real people, their real behavior, real expressions of the emotions, etc. In one word, they can reveal also the reality as it has been seen and perceived by artists behind these collections of photos, something unseen and non-existing in the frame of the official photography or politically correct imagery of the Soviet period. So within the history, as I mentioned, of Georgian visual arts, Gigo Gabashvili is considered as one of the founders of realist school of painting. And with the discovery of his archives, his work have earned a special place also within the history of Georgian photography as well, something that we have ignored till 2012, despite the fact that the artist passed away in 1936, and all the archives have been well hidden in the caves of the Museum of Fine Arts of Georgia. So the artistic environment on the period of 20s and 30s of 20th century was dominated by Soviet ideological dogmas and strict puritanical attitudes, but Gabashvili, a proclaimed realistic painter, created visual experiments that were impregnated with a refined and daring erotism. Within the context of the most oppressive period of the Soviet regime, because these are the first decades of real terror, a period when different points of view, ways of thinking, living, and aspiring were highly punishable. The non-canonical photography of Gigo Gabashvili may be seen even as a rebellious act against Soviet dogmas, permitted scenarios, homogeneousness, and banality. Gigo Gabashvili's photography, as well as his paintings, are seasoned with religious and mythological subtext and symbols. Allegories and fantasies are present and the fantasies are present as well. However, it is accurate to describe his painting as canonical, whereas photography and its visual practice allowed Gabashvili to create an experimental dogma free platform. Gabashvili releases himself from both censorship and self-censorship. His photographs are distinguished by an erotic acerbity unparalleled in the period and under the regime that he lived through, and reveal the hidden and exceptionally beautiful aspirations of this renowned painter and founder of realism. So the archives of his negatives consist of the archives consist of 684 negatives, and they are still kept in the Museum of Fine Arts. And only in 2011, not 12, sorry, but 11, the first exhibition of his work has been shown publicly, and that's also the date when we start talking about Gabashvili as painter and working with his archives. And now let's go to the 2,000 meters above the sea level in the company of shepherds in northeast of Georgia. Shalwa Al-Khanaidze, having being born in ordinary family of shepherds of the region, because of having poor health and having serious problems with his lungs, we still do not know how he has learned to photography, but he started to photograph because he cannot become a shepherd, and his archives gathers thousands of photos. There are two major series. On the road to Tusheti that you see images from on your screen now, and the second series named the passport photo. Not being able to become a shepherd, he starts photographing the life in Tusheti, everyday life, customs, traditions, nature, of course. And this is the very specific region, one of the most remote, isolated from the rest of the country and the world also, and inaccessible during almost 9 months. It's the same, it did not change. It's the same currently. So we see this collection gathers the images of Al-Khanaidze trying to document the life that he was not able to be part fully, as he could not practice the profession or métier of shepherd. And also extremely interesting, the period that cover Al-Khanaidze's chronicles coincides with the decision of the Communist Party leaders to empty the region in order to create the Soviet military bases. It was like a big scale project, and the process has started in the early 60s by demolishing the village schools and some other barbar actions by Soviets, and that forced, of course, local population to leave their habitation places and settle into the valley. And since then, the region changed totally. And this collection of images by Al-Khanaidze is also the last documents of the life in Tusheti before the radical and dramatical changes. So here are a few more images of shepherds and lady having siesta. And another very interesting series by Al-Khanaidze, Passport for Photo. In his at his home, he settled an improvised photo studio where he was taking the portraits of the village people wishing to have a passport photo. So he was making, now you see the full frame, but he was cropping, and that was also his way of making his living by making the portraits, the photos for the passport. And I should say that This collection of portraits, it's also unique in the whole history of the Soviet period. This kind of portraits and this approach to portraying people is also unique in Alfanez's collection. So the same story, the archive has been discovered totally by accident in 2007. Me personally, I learned from a friend of mine that his grandfather was a photographer in mountains, and there is a huge archive that the grandma wants to throw away after the grandpa's death because it's full of dust and everything. And I just said, maybe before throwing away, you can just show me. And so we have discovered this huge and wonderful archives, and we didn't stop working with it since 2007. And the third and the last artist that I would love to focus on is Rezo Kazeli. In his archives also has been discovered in early 19th. It was an abandoned archive, and by rediscovering this collection or archives, because it's like about 4,000 negatives, gathers 4,000 negatives, we have discovered another example of non-mainstream photography in Georgia under the Soviet regime, in series of the images of his contemporaries, Tbilisian celebrities, his friends, or just city dwellers. Rezo Kazeli unveils the chronicles of kind of unbearable lightness of being of the generation of 60s in Georgia. And the identity of the artist behind the collection of images was eventually revealed a few years later in 1999 after publication of one of these images on the local press, and we got family in touch with us, and that's how we learned more about the identity of the artist. Some of the views of Georgia made in between 60 in early 60s. Very unusual landscapes, and of course what strikes in the photography by Rezo Kazeli is the playfulness and the very different use of visual codes, or even very different visual codes that were unusual for Soviet period photography, and all of this sets the collection apart from very rigid state-sanctioned and controlled Soviet photography that left hardly any space for anything but propaganda, filling this memory hole with spontaneous images of family and friends, portrait parties, landscapes, insignificant and special events, work or vacations. The collection of images by Rezo Kazeli sketches out a rich and full life, not to say real life, under the pressing political regime. This unbearable charm of the being that strikes in the images of Rezo Kazeli has no analogues in the Soviet period photography in the Stalinization period announced by Nikita Khrushchev, Communist Party leader in USSR. Only similarities can be found in a few brilliant examples of Georgian new wave cinema, especially I think of Ottavio Seliani's visionary movies that has been inspired by the before unexpected freedom of expression in visual art. From that very period, the visual language was reinvented by different artists practicing different mediums, including photography, in order to express their resilience to the pressing political and socio-cultural context, and to question the notion of art as a form of resilience. The hidden archives that this talk has focused on represent examples of non-official and definitely politically incorrect imagery of Soviet period, while their authors can be considered as the precursors of the new generation of artists that have used the medium of photography as form of resilience to the dogmas of pressing political regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nestan, for that wonderful presentation. If we can
Thank you.
get all of the
Yes,
panelists up.
yeah, that's what I'm trying. No, not new share, but oh no, sorry, stop share.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So we are ready to open up for questions and discussion. People should be able to unmute themselves, but feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in the chat and we will take them. But thank you so much for those wonderful presentations, which kind of evoked so much about how photography and image making are used as kind of used as a medium for political participation and experimentation, but also importantly a technology of co-presence across Zoom, across live streaming, across social media photography, etc. So I can see that we already have a couple of questions. I see Karen has a question. Would you like to kick things off?
Sure.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. Thank you so much for these really wonderful and rich presentations. I wondered if all three of you would comment further on the idea of the amateur or the intimate, which to me was present in all three of the presentations. In Susan's, you're sort of opening up, or people are opening up their very intimate memories and travels through space. In Ileana's, you mentioned this sort of different aesthetic of the amateur documentation and the kind of immediacy and unpolished rawness that produces in these circulating documents. And Nestan, it seemed to me that the images that you were looking at drew very heavily on genres of ordinary photography. And I wondered if in fact, those archives are things that you might put into juxtaposition with these three auteurs that you've highlighted, images of picnics and ordinary life and even passport photos. So I guess I wondered, especially, and this is sort of following from yesterday's conversations, when there's this sort of blurring between the photojournalist as a professional or the art photographer as a professional, and the sort of massive proliferation of image making among ordinary people. What is the status of the intimate and the amateur in this moment? And thank you again for great presentations.
Ileana, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, I can share. The thing is, I mean, there's many ways, it's a fascinating topic, and I think there's many ways to approach it. But what I want to share with you was something that to me became immediately kind of evident in the Nicaraguan context. So after the protests began in April, and they went on for about 3 months until they were completely kind of squashed. There was the Organization of American States runs the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, right? So the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights organized kind of an independent panel of experts that analyzed the Nicaraguan situation. They published a report, it's about this thick, documenting the human rights abuses in Nicaragua in the context of the protests. What I found absolutely fascinating, so they also did something really interesting because they used multiple media. So on the one hand, they published this massive report that was textual, but they also produced a website, kind of very similar to the type of work that, say, forensic architecture does, where they traced every single incident through the images and videos that were posted online on social media. Yeah. Also, in addition to that, it was material that was submitted by witnesses. It was material that was submitted by families and friends of people who were killed or who were injured or who were imprisoned by the regime. anyhow, my point is that when it came to producing this human rights supporting documentation, that was the immediate material that the expert commission drew to. So, it kind of gives me the chills actually to think about that something that might seem so insignificant in the moment becomes kind of the main source of evidence for an international commission that ultimately is the only body that stands in the way of this government continuing to operate with impunity, which is currently the case. Yeah. So I think that, to me right now, the question is very much about impact, and very much about what does what produces, what generates kind of more impact in that particular kind of human rights sense in this context of the protests. Yeah. So I think that a lot of the questions that I had before witnessing these protests in person, a lot of the questions that I framed around photography, around documentary photography, around photojournalism were very different. And I think once I saw in person, people on the street kind of showing each other. I mean, I saw people over the age of 60 who definitely did not grow up with, smartphones, just on the street asking, hey, how do I do this Facebook Live thing? And then some younger kid shows up and is like showing the abuela, the grandma, hey, this is how you do it. And she does it. And she pulls that camera in front of a riot policeman, yeah, as a form of defense. So I know this is like, I'm kind of just circumnavigating I'm just moving her in many different directions around the question. And yeah, I mean, it's a multi-layered response, I suppose, but I wanted to bring out this aspect that to me became just so impacting, which was, it doesn't even matter that the picture isn't polished, that it is unclear, that it's completely shaken. It doesn't matter that whoever took it maybe doesn't have the technical ability to kind of, calibrate it correctly and all of that. It kind of becomes irrelevant. Rather, if it's an image that can serve this kind of immediate purpose in a human rights crisis, that kind of completely shifts the hierarchy of value. And I think that kind of holds ground in an anthropological sense as well. I'm someone who was trained as an art historian, disqualifying, I suppose, in many ways, images like that. Obviously, art history has shifted as a discipline and so on and so forth. But, that's the kind of discarded material of everyday life that wouldn't have any kind of importance in traditional conversations around aesthetics and photography, especially coming from an art history kind of background or a curatorial background. Whereas, for anthropologists, that's kind of really, really like that grimy stuff is like the interesting stuff. Yeah. But either way, like, I feel like there's a way in which what we're seeing in contemporary protests, especially in the context of contemporary protests, especially and with the use of social media, extensive use of social media, is like a really kind of strong blurring of boundaries. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, Ileana, I just would add one important detail. It's all about the metadata. It's valuable because of the metadata. So when they create this web of information that's evidential, they can actually target exactly where someone was at a specific moment in time. And therefore they create a kind of nexus or an intersection of information, the way forensic architecture is so brilliantly done. So that becomes invaluable. So it's not just a photograph floating around, it's anchored very specifically. And that, I mean, that's just, it's a detail, but it's the essence of what makes the digital world. It flattens in some ways, as you're saying, Karen, it flattens the distinction between, I mean, some of the people that, interestingly, you would know that the sort of the copyright Ileana is protecting with the wire photographers or those that were working for the local press, distinguished from that which just came from an iPhone. It's all the same when it gets in that informational base. That's not the determining factor. It's where they were, at what point, what did they see, what did they frame, what it can evidentially kind of not prove, but document.
Yeah, it's almost
it
like
goes back to the legal, you had to have been there to be able to, submit a photograph into a court because, you had to say, this is the image that I made. Metadata in that sense has supplanted the necessity of that.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a crucial element, and it almost makes it feel like, the image is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's all these other kind of infrastructure layers underneath it that are extremely important to consider, and that we very often just kind of browse over, fixating on whatever is at the center of the image, the punctum, the studium, and whatever other theoretical means we might find to kind of narrow in.
And maybe I will also add from my side, I'm sorry, I had to change the place because I had a very bad internet, and I hope you hear me well now. Concerning these three archives that I talked about, this is very interesting case for us, because all we know about photography from Soviet period, it's like this polished official photography where everything was hidden, and there was like layers between the image and the real state of things and the reality. And three of the artists whose archives I presented today, they are amateur photographers. So as I mentioned, one shepherd, one artist, one filmmaker. And what is interesting for me, that from that period, from 20s to 70s or even 80s, we learn about real photography from amateur artists. We learn about real life from amateur artists. We learn how dogmas, all the dogmas settled and established by Soviet period, have been overcome and overpassed from amateur photography collections. And we learn also from these collections how the photography and the medium has been used otherwise than allowed by the regime. So for me, I consider, and then I think, just very banal way, most of the biggest photographers, they are amateurs. So what does the mean professional and amateur is? It's like the whole discussion, I guess. But for us, and in our case, it's an incredible thing that in this total desert, which is desert of photographie d'auteur in the Soviet period, we discover three big collections, as three of them are produced by amateur artists. So vive les amateurs.
Yeah, Karen, I don't know if it was obvious in my presentation, but the issue of amateur was totally irrelevant. Obviously, people were writing on, annotating photographs that I may have made that circulated via Zoom. They were contributing photographs that they may have found in their own iPhones or others. And it wasn't the relevance of the image in the storytelling was really the kind of setting for which they could then articulate whatever they wanted to express. And so it's the layering that I was more interested in than the actual image itself.
Thank you so much.
We have a question for Ileana in the chat. Evelyn, would you like to ask it yourself, or should I read it out? Okay, it says, hi Ileana, thank you very much for your enlightening talk. Could you please elaborate on your methods, for example, web scraping and tools, ethnography on the ground, etc.?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to. Okay, so I was doing field work in Nicaragua when the protests began. So, and it was a very kind of, it was a very big deal. I mean, what happened was huge, and it took me completely by surprise. And I feel like in many ways I lacked the means to kind of properly wrap my mind around what was going on, because it was all very fast and it was very violent also. But yes, so I did on the ground ethnography. I observed as much as I could. I had as many conversations as I possibly could. I didn't sleep for over a month. And I accumulated an enormous amount of screenshots. Basically, WhatsApp was on fire. Everything I could find there's things that I took screenshots of that I haven't opened since because I'm not sure yet how to negotiate kind of the anonymizing people, the kind of the, you have to think also it's a context where the regime is targeting people who participated in those protests. So I'm hyper aware of how whatever I do might impact people on the ground. But yeah, so there was a lot of I was using Facebook, basically the media that I knew people were listening to, were looking at. That's what I did as well. And I was also trying to monitor on the side kind of government channels, especially on TV, and to just as a counterpart to see what they were kind of showing. But it was obviously complete avoidance of what was happening on the streets. So I ended up kind of dropping that. But anyhow, like I've accumulated basically a full hard drive of primarily screenshots, memes, things that were shared on WhatsApp. And also, you know, I tried to take pictures myself, and I have many notebooks of conversations. It's a very fragmented record, and I'm working through it still. But yeah, that's basically, that was basically it.
Thanks, Ileana. Kostis, do you want to go and then Chris?
Sure. Thank you all for tremendous presentations. I have a brief question for each. First, Suzanne, I was thinking you're known for these tremendously emblematic photographs historically. And in your work, in the work you showed now, but also in other work, you seem to advocate for going beyond the one iconic single photograph into something that is more continuous. Social engagement has to do with incorporating sketches, meetings. So I wondered if you could comment a little more about this, the difference between the single iconic photograph and what you think that does politically, and the need to go beyond the photograph in order to address socially sensitive, socially pertinent issues like the ones you're dealing with in your work in Portugal and elsewhere. Ileana, short one, you seem to be talking about, one of the things that you're talking about has to do with a question, with the discussion we're having yesterday about particularity, invocativeness, and indexicality. And I was thinking of the notorious Sontag argument that one of the problems with photography is that it depoliticizes by decontextualizing. But what you're showing shows actually that there is something else going on, and it's the capacity to move beyond the specificity of the context that makes the images you're talking about reusable and politically pertinent. So I was wondering whether you want to comment about whether we're dealing with a reappropriation, a skewing of the context, repoliticizing through decontextualizing, something along those lines. And finally, Nestan, you partly addressed this, but I just I'm going to ask something intentionally simplistic, which is the three artists you showed are quite different in their visual content. And I was wondering whether the question to be asked here is what exactly about their work visually is dangerous for the regime, and perhaps it's not the content. Okay, the first artist you showed, Gapashvili, right? He's the one who has more explicit content, and that's more evident. But with the others, it becomes, I think, more elusive. So perhaps the question of what it is visually that it's dangerous is not what's happening here. It's about normativity. It's about deviating from a canonical set of rules. So something extra photographic rather than visual in itself. Thank you.
Well, in that you asked the question to me first, it's, you know, I actually don't know the answer. If we hadn't been in COVID, how it would have been different for me. I mean, so this question of just being present and being with camera on the ground that I began with, what else could I contribute? I think that the question of layering is less unusual for me, because I think that storytelling in various ways, counterpointing different media, has been part of my ongoing visual vocabulary when appropriate. But I do have the question of what if it hadn't been COVID? Then how would I have collaborated with the community in a different way? That I can't answer. But you know, I think whether it's my own photographs or those fused with the annotations of others, that's a territory that I'm continuously interested in exploring, and actually touches base to Ileana, just as a footnote. as she may or may not know, but I received a Facebook image of the Molotov Men with one of the men that you showed throwing a rock, saying, you know, just with 40 years later, and then made a postcard out of that I then brought into the most recent exhibition I've had about Nicaragua. But the kind of question you raised, going back to even what Karen was asking about, so-called the professional slash the documentary slash ethnographer slash, you know, whoever we might be that make images. I think once that Facebook is what alerted me to the intensity of the immediacy Ileana conveyed. My response to go was still somewhat tortured as to whether or not I was needed or useful or necessary in any sense. So what did my eyes contribute? Probably nothing of significance. Well, on the other hand, for me to understand in an ongoing way this place in time was essential, and I felt I had to be there to truly make sense of what was happening. And so, my question back to Ileana was to what extent you were collecting as things were unfolding or retrospectively, because certainly I then went on to collect retrospectively from those I knew who sent images, and then also, have gathered an archive just as time has moved on. It's very different to understand it in the moment, and my instinct was divided. There was a contradiction of feeling the necessity to go, but not being needed to be there at the same time.
I feel like I'm going to try to combine answers, but I just wanted to say about what you were just saying, Susan, how I feel like your method of to keep revisiting is really mandatory, because I remember when I decided to leave Nicaragua, and I had a Skype call with Chris actually, and he was saying, write down as much as you can, because it will leave you, and I tried, and I look back at some of the thoughts I had, and it's just incredible how different perception and perspective is. And like you, Susan, I also exactly like I revisited the things that I collected. There were also other things that I missed at the time that people later shared. Facebook, I've noticed, actually acts very much as a kind of a memory, this whole memory machine thing. So it acts as a memorial device too, especially since public space is completely policed now in Nicaragua, virtual space too. But people still post things on social media, and it's to memorialize events from the protests. And so it's kind of really interesting how it's just these kinds of comings and goings around particular images. Images are almost the excuse for other kind of conversations to unfold, which I found really interesting. And I guess to kind of go into Costis's question, my mind's just in many different directions, but I think that it's really interesting what you're saying, Costis, and I'm trying to make up my mind where I stand on it. I really think that with reappropriations in Nicaragua, what makes them so powerful is their context. I really do, because the generation that kind of came out in the street and staged this new insurrection, they're basically the nephews and nieces of the people who participated and organized the original insurrection. They're familiar with the language through and through. It's kind of like Greek mythology, but like it's Nicaraguan mythology, but things also mean. So that said, these symbols and these icons of the revolution mean something at an official level, right, as a kind of a nation story, but they also mean something. And this goes back to what Karen was saying about intimacy, in a way, thinking about intimacy and projected intimacy onto social media. People also have a way of relating to these stories that's very personal, and that is through their personal family kind of stories and histories that they kind of tell each other, that they've been told since they were very young. So it's a very kind of embodied memory, and these images, including Susan's iconic image, photograph of the Molotov Men, there's a level to which it's been incorporated into state propaganda. There's a level to which you could even say, it's been kind of stripped of its Benjaminian aura. you know, it just kind of replicates itself in ways that are just like no longer at all have any connection to the historic revolution at all. But at the same time, I think that these reclamations, the way in which it's been reclaimed, very much embedded even deeper into that context. And then different people will kind of explain their own connections to that image in very different ways. And, you know, what I also want to say that was really interesting. So that photograph, the Molotov Men, has become a national monument as an image, but also as an actual monument. Like there's monuments of it that were created in different localities around, in Estelí, the town where it was taken. But I've seen iterations of it in many other places. And Susan has a whole project documenting its kind of afterlives. What was interesting on social media was that actually it didn't live online for too long. It was kind of like really quickly discarded. So I think that the conversation and what you're saying, Costis, about Sontag's argument and the whole thinking about indexicality and all that, I think that what also needs to, I think there's things that we can still, that it leads to really productive conversation, but I think also just the very kind of way in which it is instantiated online just completely shifts the terms of conversation. And like I said, it just seemed like, to me, it just seemed very apparent that whether it was Susan's image or that was reappropriated or another iconic image like the figure of Sandino, it was really quick, like how it went through, the memes went through, so they could become viral at one point and they could become replicated in different ways, like I showed with the figure throwing the rock. So it could be on a t-shirt or it could be as a stencil, but it just kind of moved through, shuffled really quick. So there was no attachment in the same way that, say, there's an attachment to the more traditional iconic image. And I guess we can think about like Harriman and Lucchese and how they kind of theorize the iconic images. And so I think there's a very deep shift in the way in which these reappropriations operate in environments, in an online environment that's very active and just constantly shifting and moving. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but we kind of need to keep time because we have a very special occasion happening in the midst of the session. Chris, do you want to take over?
Oh, should I do that rather than just very quickly ask a question of?
It's up to you. It's 3:20. I'm
We'll have
going
a shorter
to
break, right?
Can we,
Yeah.
go over?
Okay, well, let me ask a very quick.
Also, Nestan, I'm sorry. I feel like you also, there's a tiny bit of a question left from
Well, I had
Costis as well.
a very quick question for Nestan and Susan, a Benjaminian question to continue the Walter Benjamin theme. So, I mean, the question for Nestan is, you know, I understand the skepticism and resentment towards Soviet socialist realist photography as a practice. I was curious to know how Georgians feel about photographic thinkers who were associated with Soviet ideals. So, you know, including Walter Benjamin, Osip Brick and others. Are they kind of persona non grata as well? And then for just quickly for Susan, you said that your frames are constrained and controlled by others, which I think for a lot of anthropologists here who find themselves increasingly engaging indigenous media, there'd be a lot of echoes there, the sort of sense that we become literal photocopiers almost. And I was wondering whether, and I don't mean this in an auteurist sense, but whether you find yourself wanting to or feel yourself frustrated by being unable to activate the optical unconscious in your camera work. I mean, if all you're doing is photographing Zoom screens. But maybe Nestan, it sounds like Nestan had a quick response.
Yeah, to respond quickly, no skepticism, Chris, because they were like just not existing. They were like even not considered this, I would say, the major thinkers and theorists and writers whose works are for us and in Occidental photographic or even larger art historian circles and seen considered as major works. They were not translated, so not known, not practiced, so no skepticism, nothing, nada. it starts now. Translations and like new generation of art historians start to mention maybe Benjamin. So we mention now a lot Susan Sontag at Benjamin while talking about photography, and but before and in Soviet times they were non-existing, as photographie d'auteur was non-existing also at that period.
Yeah, Chris, just a quick answer. Maybe I was most surprised by the pleasure I had in making photographs via Zoom. The frustration was that the way that the tool was working, of course, someone was with an iPhone in order for me to connect via Zoom to see what they were seeing. And at times I wanted them to go left or go right, or if I were free to move myself, my own body. It's always, when you're a photographer, you're moving your body closer, further, and all of that movement was so frozen for me. So it wasn't making the frames that I found that was frustrating. It was not having enough to see, being constrained in that sense. But I remember when the first artists began to work with Google Streets and just literally photographing the world from sitting at their computers, and I was horrified by it. And that's in the end what I was doing essentially. If it becomes the excuse to not engage in the world, I have no interest in that. But it was the only means to engage in this particular circumstance. And as I said, I'm really still processing what those 4 months were really about. The intensity of them was surprising, the intimacy of them even more so. Because as we've all experienced with Zoom, this extraordinary gathering of nearly 100 people from all over the world, something we couldn't have imagined 5 years ago. So without our physical bodies being present, yeah. But I still miss the physical body being present. It's still central for me.
Over to Vindhya, I think.
I also just want to point to the really fascinating question and comment in the chat from Alvaro, and I see Ileana has already responded to it, and I wonder whether we should wrap up with that because it's such a good one. Alvaro, are you there? Would you like to take the question, or are the panelists happy to look at the question from the chat? Because it's quite a long one.
I can read it for Alvaro.
Oh, sure, please.
He says, I'm a Nicaraguan amateur photographer. He's not an amateur. He can say that about himself, of course, but I know his work and it's beautiful. He says, I feel Nicaragua 2018 protests were so unexpected and neither government, activists, or political opposition were prepared. So the quickest choice for everyone was to read what was happening through the past. And I think a lot of Susan's 79 images and others from that period played a huge part in that, and even how people acted. And then also that started a kind of fight for the property of that visual history, government and opposition reclaiming it for themselves. All this makes me wonder how the visual precedes political activism and not vice versa, and how framing the present through the past images that may become something that blocks reading what's truly happening. Just a comment. Yeah, really brilliant.
Great. Well, that's a fantastic way to move into our very special moment.
Excellent.
Which is also concerns Susan and her achievements. So on behalf of Heidi Geismar, Chair of the Royal Anthropological Photographic Committee, I'm honoured to be able to present the 2021 Royal Anthropological Photographic Studies Award to Susan Meiselas. The award is given in recognition of the influential contribution of a scholar and/or practitioner to the broader fields of anthropology and photography. And this year we have the perfect recipient. Ileana Selejan will now offer her estimation of Susan's contribution to our understandings of the political affordances and possibilities of photography. And she's going to read a brief text.
Yes, thank you, Chris, and it's an honor, really. So throughout her multifaceted career, Susan Meiselas has made tremendous contributions to the field of photography at the intersection with human rights and anthropology. Her interest in multidisciplinary approaches, the ability to move and shift her own viewing position along with her subject, to reflect upon the intricate politics of representation, the depth of analysis and critical acuity, her many departures and returns, enabled a shared ground upon which her projects unfold. Her commitment to photography's social mission is revealed from the very beginning of her career through projects such as Carnival Strippers from 72 to 75, published in book form in 76, which profiled women working in girls' shows, so-called girls' shows at summer carnivals in New England in the United States, and which combined observational documentary work and audio testimonies. She became a member of the prestigious agency Magnum Photos thereafter. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, she worked in collaboration with various local actors and organizations to expose human rights abuses in Latin America, tirelessly documenting the consequences of armed conflict in Central America. Her most extensive body of work developed around Nicaragua, starting with her photographic documentation of the Sandinista popular insurrection of 1978-79, and the publication of the book, Nicaragua, June 1978, July 1979, came out in 1981. Over the past 4 decades, she has continued to work in the country, revisiting this work, observing how the memory of the revolution continues to impact everyday life. Her documentary, Pictures from a Revolution from 1991, explored the afterlives of these photographs through the lived experience of their protagonists, ordinary citizens who participated in the struggle against the Somoza dictatorship. Later installations, such as the mural project Reframing History from 2004 and Mediations from 78 to 82, which concerns the circulation of her photographs through international media channels and popular culture, have likewise presented opportunities to reflect upon the fluidity of photography, its shifting meanings within any given context. Subsequently, Meiselas moved on to further geographies, exploring an ever-diversifying range of experimental and multimedia approaches. Her book and exhibition project, Encounters with the Dani from 2003, took on a quintessential anthropological subject. Following her trip to the Balian Valley in New Guinea, together with anthropologist and filmmaker Robert Gardner, she sought to document the ways in which the Dani have, quote, been seen by travelers, anthropologists, missionaries, colonialists, and perhaps themselves throughout the century, and through available technology to create access to that work and a dialogue with the Dani about that representation, end quote. Later, her project Kurdistan in the Shadow of History, 91 to 2007, would likewise seek to revert the photographer's gaze, mobilizing resources towards the creation of a communal visual archive of the Kurdish people. The website, aka Kurdistan 1998, culled photographs, videos, and accounts from around the world, providing an invaluable repository for collective memory. Like many of her projects to date, here too, the photographer seeks to serve as a conduit and a mediator to enable a conversation through the photographic image. Meiselas has been president of the Magnum Foundation since its founding in 2007. She was named a MacArthur Fellow in 1992 and has received numerous awards and prizes, including the Robert Capa Gold Photography Prize in 94, a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2015, a Cornell Capa Infinity Award in 2005, and the Deutsche Börse Photography Foundation Prize in 2019. Her recent survey exhibition, Mediations, was on view in many locations, the Fundación Anthony Tapis, the Jeu de Paume, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Instituto Moreira Salles, and opened last night at the Kunsthaus Wien in Vienna. So, yeah.
So thanks, Ileana, for that elegant overview of an incredible body of work from which anthropologists have a great deal to learn. In Karen Strassler's presentation yesterday on image events, I was thinking of J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words. Ileana's citation does things with words and performs conferring the RAI Photographic Studies Award. But in keeping with the themes of these conversations, and to echo yesterday's discussion of image events and Susan's description of photographing Zoom screens from Porto, I'm also going to do a thing with a camera and record for the future Susan's new status. That way we can be in no doubt about what happened. You'll bear with me just for a moment. Got it. So congratulations, Susan. Thank you for everything you've done and for the inspiration you've given to the Citizens of Photography Collective and to the wider body of anthropology. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
Do I get to say that I'm so deeply honored to be amongst those with words with which I have few, and I'm deeply honored, truly.
Right.
So thank you for inviting me to be an ongoing listener to this conversation. Whether or not I can fully participate, Chris. Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, Vin.